David Swerdlick. How are you? Associate editor of theroot.com, one of my favorite websites. I got to tell you, my man, I wake up every morning around 4 o'clock and get to my iPad, and the first place I go is to the Root. It's some really good information that you have there, so I do appreciate you coming on.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. Good morning, Joe. Thanks for having me. We actually, I'm not sure if it's up yet, but we're actually going to do a slideshow today pointing out some famous members of Phi Beta Sigma for their 100-year anniversary. And I didn't know that Bill Clinton was an honorary member of Phi Beta Sigma, which
I was just going to ask you any other people any other names we might be surprised.
Well, I think that was the surprising one. I think it was kind of a cool one. I know James Weldon Johnson, the composer of Lift Every Voice.
Yeah, NACP executive, right? Founder,
yeah,
right.
And you know a few other notables. Emmett Smith. No, it's a big day for them, and no, I think it's great that you did that tribute to them at the top there. That was nice.
Let me get to a piece that you did that caught our attention. And that is the 5 things that President Obama got right last year. I take it there were more than 5 things. I might be wrong. I don't want to assume. But how did you select these 5 things, and what were those 5 things?
Well, no, I think you're right. There probably were, a longer list of things that Obama, in fact, did right last year. But, here's how it came about for me looking at the issue, Joe, and that was that, we're already here into almost mid-January. But over the holidays, I know your listeners know, there were all these articles about how President Obama had such a terrible 2013. It was a disastrous 2013. And when I took a step back from it, Joe, I was like, nah, it really wasn't. And so I looked at the issues people were saying were disasters for the president, and I was like, well, wait a second. Some of these things, in particular, in my view, Syria, the shutdown,
right.
A couple of other things, he actually wound up handling pretty well. And I think that the critics just sort of jumped on the bandwagon without really thinking through that the president really handled some of these things maybe not always smoothly, but very intelligently last year.
Well, and I guess one of the things that sort of painted a negative image, because negativity has far more impact than something positive, unfortunately,
right?
Unless it's the capture of bin Laden, but and that was this terrible rollout of the Affordable Care Act, and I guess that just lingered throughout the last quarter.
No, it did linger, and look, it was a clumsy rollout in November and December. The president was criticized from all sides, and I think it's fair to criticize the way the rollout happened. Look, President Obama is not above criticism, but what I tried to point out in my piece, Joe, and I think, this is one of the things that I think you were alluding to, is that, mistakes were made, but they were made in the service of what I think people are coming to see as a good goal, trying to bring health coverage to 20 or 30 million people who not only don't have health coverage, but weren't looking at getting it anytime soon if it wasn't for the Affordable Care Act. So when the critics want to kind of jump in, and I was someone myself who criticized him for the rollout,
right.
But when the critics jump in and say, oh, this is a fiasco, this was clumsy, what happened with Secretary Sebelius and the president, I say, look, they are trying to do something major here. People are out there struggling without health coverage, and they are trying to bring it to them. And so I think that in the rearview mirror of history is going to look well on them and not like a disaster.
Why was Syria a positive in quote unquote a positive? Why was Syria? Why did you list Syria?
Well, as you and your listeners may have noticed, we're not in a war in Syria right now, are we? And I think that's the thing that got overlooked. Look, there's a whole foreign policy angle where people can look at this and say thousands of Syrians are dying. They're in a terrible civil war. I don't want to make light of that. People are being killed, and it's brutal there. But as the commander-in-chief, President Obama's top responsibility and obligation is to the American people and to the American men and women in uniform. And when he was contemplating this missile strike because of Syria's use of chemical weapons, I think the president's position, although at the time it was criticized as he was kind of not sure where he stood, he got out there in front and he said, look, as commander-in-chief, I'm willing to use military force. I want to put a stop to this. I'm ready to launch a missile strike. But he kind of looked around him and said, look, Congress is not on board. The people are not on board. And I would argue, Joe, that this is exactly one of the reasons that Obama was elected in the first place. He's the type of leader that has the capacity to look around and say, wait a second, people aren't quite there yet with me. I'm going to take a step back. And he's not going to just launch into a war like maybe his predecessor, just to look tough or decisive. He's going to step back and say, even if I have a little egg on my face or on my shoes, the most important thing is not to get out ahead of the American people. I think he should be commended for that, and people should remind themselves why they voted for him in the first place.
Well, this
on that basis.
This sort of also speaks to this discussion, and I know you've been following it. This discussion, David, about Gates's memoirs. I'm finding it interesting how the media is playing this. Obviously, they've got to sell books, and you know about selling books. You got to find something controversial. But when I hear, I read that Gates said, well, former President Bush, enjoyed meeting with the generals and admirals, and President Obama saw it as an obligation. I don't see that as a negative.
No, not at all. I'm right there with you, Joe. And here's the thing, right? I've looked into the Gates book, and even though the book's not out, of course, there are lots of excerpts out there. And I agree with you. The coverage has been that this is a bombshell, that Gates went off on Obama. But you know what? When you sift through what Gates says, and I think you're right there. When you sift through what Gates said, he never said, I disagreed with Obama's policy. He never said, I disagreed with Obama's decision. He just simply says he got the sort of feeling or vibe that Obama didn't feel the same way about his commander-in-chief role as Bush. But guess what? That's probably a good thing for the American people.
I'm old enough to go back to Kennedy, who didn't feel very comfortable with his military, especially after the Bay of Pigs.
Right. When you're the president, and when you're President Obama, and you take over two wars, he took over Iraq and Afghanistan in year 6 and 7.
Right.
You should be skeptical of how the generals have been handling the wars, because you say to yourself, here I come, and it's in my inbox, and you've had it for 6 or 7 years. The commander-in-chief should ask the generals tough questions, and he should try and steer the policy in a different direction. The funny thing, too, about Gates, Joe, is that one of the best decisions, I would argue, that President Obama made early on was keeping Secretary Gates on the one cabinet holdover from the Bush administration. I think that made a big difference in getting the confidence of the Pentagon that President Obama wasn't just going to tip over the apple cart. He was going to try and bring some continuity to how they were handling these wars. And I'm not sure if Gates, I think Gates tries to give him some credit for that, but I'm not sure if that's what's being reported right now.
David is an associate editor of the Root.com, and I tell all of you, please make sure that that's part of your daily reading. And he covers national politics from outside the Beltway perspective, and he's written for thegrio.com and Business Insider, BET, Ebony, NPR, and we finally have him here with us on the Madison show. So you can add that to your bio. How's that, man?
All right, I appreciate that.
Now, finally, let me have you talk about how President Obama can be successful in 2014. I'm of the impression this is probably one of the most important political years that our generation is going to face. There's so much in the balance. And he's only got about, in all honesty, probably less than a year and a half.
That's right.
Honesty.
Joe, I think you're right. And look, the president is going to be coming up with his State of the Union address in about 3 weeks.
All right.
And I think that'll be the first time that he's going to have the full attention of the American people coming out of the holidays and coming out of the new year. And I think this is the time for the president just to lay out, I think, a very strong but a very focused agenda. If you've listened to his past State of the Union addresses, he's kind of done the typical presidential thing, a laundry list of things. I'm going to say this time I would recommend, if the the Team Obama is listening, to come out and just tick off the 3 or 4 things they're really going to tackle. Unemployment generally, and also specifically for African Americans, is still very high. People want something done about that. I think it's also, he's going to talk about immigration reform, and I think that's something both parties are really going to have to tighten their view and their message on.
All right.
They probably will take another bite at the apple of gun control, although I'm not sure that's going to go anywhere in the Senate. And then, he is going to make some pushes in foreign policy, right? They feel like they've got something going with this negotiation with Iran and so forth. The president has actually done quite a lot in the last 5 years. I would say the next 2 to 3 years are more about nailing down what they've already done and less about trying to break a whole lot of new ground.
But isn't this going to be, as it has been, extremely difficult in an election year? So here's the question, and that is, as it relates to the Republican Party, should they continue this attitude that we're going to make sure this man fails, or is this going to catch up with them and be detrimental in this political year?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Joe, in terms of what's at stake in terms of the politics for the 2014 midterms. I would say 2 things real quickly.
Okay.
One would be that I don't think the Democrats have any chance of bringing back the House, so they should just sort of focus on the Senate. In order for Democrats and for President Obama to get what they want done, they're going to have to hold the Senate. The House, I think, is just past them for the next 2 years. In terms of pushing an agenda, though, the Republicans, of course, will continue to oppose Obama at basically every turn, but I'm not sure the Republicans have as big of an advantage as they think they do, and this goes back to talking about what Obama did right last year. By staring Republicans down over that government shutdown, the net result was that in December, Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan reached a 2-year budget deal that's passed. The budget is not, I'm not going to say it's off the table, but that's like a big item that's been ticked off out of the way now. It's going to be much harder for Republicans to sort of hold Obama's legislative agenda hostage without that budget thing for the next 2 years. And so, yes, they're going to try and thwart him. I'm not sure they're going to be as successful as they think they are.
You think that they're going to? You think that they will try to bring? They will bring up the debt ceiling, but do you think that they'll make it as much of an issue as they did the last time around?
They will probably bring up the debt ceiling. There will be some hardliner Republicans in the House and even a few in the Senate, like Senator Ted Cruz, who may want to take another bite at that apple. But again, because we've seen this movie before,
right,
because the president did stare them down last time, I'm not saying they won't bring it up, but I'm just not sure how effective that'll be, because I think the people are going to look at that and say, really, again, at a certain point, people say, maybe we're conservative, maybe we're Republican, but we don't want this just constant gridlock and self-defeating.
You know what I think? I agree with you, Dave, and I think what's happening, what I think has happened, in reporters like you, bloggers like you, talk shows like what we do, because this was such an issue, we had to explain to people what it was about. And you had to, I have an old, my grandfather told me this when I came back from college. I was at Washington University, and I came home, and I was waxing all eloquently at the dinner table, and he looked over at me and said, "Joseph, will you put it where the goats can get it?"
Right.
and I think that's what has happened. We've had to explain something most people didn't even know what it was. And now that they understand it, you're right. It's like, here we go again. Wait a minute. We've been down this road. We know we're not going to sit up here and ruin the good faith and credit of this country over some politics. The thing I am hopeful is that you're right, is that they hold the Senate, because I firmly believe if they don't hold the Senate, I'm talking about the Democrats, I'll tell you what's going to be on the table: impeachment. Impeachment is going to be on the table, and then you've got 2 years of him trying to defend himself.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that, Joe, and I think that's why Democrats, if I had one, sort of caution for Democrats, it would be, don't get cocky and try and get the House back. Try and just put the resources of the White House, the Democratic Party, the focus on holding the Senate, because, just like you said, it's one thing if for the next 2 years they don't move the ball too much forward. But boy, it would be really detrimental for the president and for the country if things started really rolling backwards. And I think impeachment would be on the table if Republicans control both houses. That's a very good point. I hope the team Obama is listening to you on that.
I hope they are. I really do. Look, David, I hope you'll come on again. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate your clarity, and we'll obviously be following your blogs. And thank you so much for being part of the Madison Show.
I appreciate it, Joe. Thanks for having me.
All right, then.